Alright guys, so now we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of the U.S. History Regents Review. This is the hit list. That's what it says on your paper, okay? I actually have a copy of your paper right here, okay? This is what your paper should look like in your study guide, okay? It's a bare bones study guide for what you need to pass the U.S. History Regents exams. This was put together by about the most frequently asked topics on the exams compiled from past exams, okay? So follow along with the video, fill in your study guide, okay? You definitely should review this, preferably more than once, before you actually have your exam. And the Mr. Hughes review videos are actually really cool. I posted a link to one of them. I believe it was from last June, like June 2018. But he's been known to do a live review session where you can ask questions and everything else the day before the exam or the night before the exam, okay? So 2 to 4 hours. I mean, they're pretty extensive and they can really help you out. So I would keep a lookout for that. I know it's not easy to pull yourself away from what you really want to do, but if you don't want to have to take your Regents exam again, you might want to try it, okay? Couldn't hurt, right? To review this stuff. Reviewing it can't hurt. Alrighty, so this is what your page looks like. Like I said, this is what my page looks like. All right. So we're going to go through this. It's basically a PowerPoint, and we're going to go through. I'm going to give you some information. I'm going to try not to expand too much on these things because I don't want to waste a whole bunch of time doing this. As you see, it's 140 pages. It's a lot. We're not going to do it in one video either. I think maybe we'll split it up into, I don't know, 3 or 4. We'll see. Okay, so you do not have 140 pages in yours. There's actually 22 pages. I counted them. It's actually 22 pages, and I'm not expecting you to do them all at once. And you don't have to fill in a lot. There's just a couple words on each one to help you get into it and help you, stay with it and follow along, okay? Remember, guys, I put these resources together for you. I'm hoping that you're utilizing them to the best of your ability. You're putting forth the effort because I passed 11th grade. Okay, I got my degree in social studies, so I've done way worse. The teacher exams are actually very similar to the Regents, so it's not fun. And but hopefully, we can get through it together, and I can get you through this, and you won't have to take the exam again. 'Cause that's no fun. All right, so I'm going to go through. We're going to start with mercantilism. Excuse me. Mercantilism was the economic system that benefits the mother country. Here, the mother country we're talking about is England. Okay, we've got the colonies. The colonies are over in North America, and their motherland is over in England. They would ship the raw materials to England. Remember, the Industrial Revolution was going on in England at this point, so factories, things were processed, they were shipped back over to the colonies, and the colonies were expected to, number one, provide the raw materials to go to the factories, and then also be a market for the finished goods after everything went through the factories, everything was processed. Like, you're shipping cotton over, it becomes clothing, they send it back, and they sell the clothing to the colonies, okay? Salutary neglect. So long as the colonists were keeping up their end of the mercantilist system, Great Britain left them alone to rule themselves. Most colonists consider themselves loyal British subjects through this period because they had many freedoms, okay? Not something they were used to. The Mayflower Compact, the House of Burgess, and the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut were examples of colonial self-rule, okay? Colonies were given the ability to rule the people who were in the colonies, okay? And they split up into states and ruled their people, okay? It's being a problem later on because we weren't one nation. We weren't operating as one nation. We were operating as 13 separate little nations. So that had to be taken care of. But moving on. The Mayflower Compact, the House of Burgess was the first representative body in the colonies. And the Mayflower Compact and the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut are examples of written documents establishing local self-government. Enlightenment ideas and natural rights. Enlightenment philosophers described how people were endowed with certain inalienable natural rights. So there was John Locke, hopefully you remember him, talked about life, liberty, and property. Baron de Montesquieu, separation of the powers of government, came up with the consent of the governed. Like you could be you can govern people as long as they agree to it. Number 5, the Declaration of Independence was not a plan of government. It was simply a statement of grievances that the colonists had against the British king. It was written by Thomas Jefferson, you know that guy, and was inspired by John Locke. After John Locke, we go into Thomas Paine and common sense. Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet. He actually wrote a lot of pamphlets, but one that was very popular was called Common Sense, to convince people to support the cause of independence. Number 7, colonial resistance tactics. And I'm following along here on mine. If I ever go too fast for you guys, you can always pause this or rewind it. That's what's so good about a video, okay? So colonial resistance tactics, committees of correspondence. The colonists organized together to spread the ideas of independence. Non-importation agreements. Colonists agreed not to buy or sell any products of Great Britain. And that goes into what you've been learning about since 2nd grade, the Boston Tea Party. Colonists dumped British tea into the port of Boston to protest British colonial practices such as taxation without representation. The colonists got a taste of being able to govern themselves, right? And they didn't want to be taxed by a government that they didn't have any representatives in, that they weren't able to have a say, okay? Boston Tea Party. Moving on. Number 8, the Articles of Confederation. It was the first American government. Okay, it's pretty weak, but it was the first American government. The strengths of the Articles of Confederation. It provided enough structure for the USA to defeat the British, and it decided how to settle new states. The weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation were that states were stronger than the federal government. The federal government did not have the power to tax, okay? The federal government did not have the power to tax. Taxes were handled by the state governments. This is where we start getting into problems where each state is operating separately. So people were worried that if we were attacked, we weren't going to have a unified government to organize and to go against whoever was attacking us. Okay, that was one of the problems. Okay, so states were handling their own taxes. Okay, federal government did not have the power to tax. Federal government did not have the power to raise an army. Again, same problem. If we get attacked, we have 13 separate governments. How are we going to put together an army? Okay, articles needed 13 of 13 states to revise them. 9 of 13 states needed to agree to pass laws. Okay, those were weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. The Northwest Ordinance was a law passed under the Articles of Confederation by the Continental Congress that established procedure for admission of new states into the Union. Northwest Ordinance. New states. The Constitutional Convention. At the Constitutional Convention, representatives were going to rewrite the Constitution, but it needed to be completely overhauled. The Great Compromise. Questions arose regarding representation. Should representation in Congress be equal between states or proportionate to the population? The compromise was a bicameral legislature, which was a Senate, which gave each state 2 votes, and the House of Representatives, which was representation by population. So if your state had more people, you had more representation. Okay? The 3/5 Compromise. Remember, slavery was big in the South at this point, right? Questions arose on how slaves would be counted. The South wanted them counted for representation, but not necessarily for taxation. If you don't understand what that means, the South wanted to use slaves to count towards their population so they would have more people to represent their state, but they didn't want to be taxed extra due to having more people, okay? The North wanted the opposite. The compromise was that every 5 slaves would count as 3 people for both representation and taxation purposes, okay? So they had this human property, and every 5 slaves counted as 3 people. 3/5 compromise. Excuse me, ratification. The new Constitution needed to be ratified by a majority of the states. The Federalist Papers were written by Hamilton, Adams, and Jay to encourage people to ratify the Constitution. Federalist Papers, trying to get people organized and get them to ratify the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists and the Federalists, they argued over whether the Constitution gave the federal government too much power. The Bill of Rights were the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which were added to satisfy the Anti-Federalists. They guarantee the limited government by providing for the freedoms of speech, press, religion, the right to bear arms, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, right to privacy, right to trial by jury, etc. Okay, we're going to go through the Bill of Rights separately. Popular sovereignty. People get to vote for what they want. Sovereignty. People get to vote for what they want. Limited government. Government does not have all the power like a dictator or a king. Remember, this is what they were trying to get away from, okay? They were worried that, if they didn't put enough rules down, even though, we have people going against rules as well, the government having too much power, which isn't good either, but they had come from being under a king, okay? They had come from, being in a monarchy, and they didn't want that again, and they didn't want the worry of that again. Okay? There are some things that the government cannot do. For example, the government can't take away your freedom of speech, press, religion, deprive you of a trial by jury, or subject you to cruel or unusual punishment. It's all good things. Federalism. Federalism is the division of power between federal, state, and local governments. It is not the separation of powers between branches. Think of the L in federal, and remember the L in levels of government. Can't talk. Okay. Federalism, enumerated or delegated powers. Powers specifically granted to the federal government. Enumerated powers or delegated powers. Powers granted to the federal government. Examples include the right to maintain a post office, build a military, coin money, and make treaties. And then there are implied powers. They're powers that were not actually given to them, but it could be interpreted through the elastic clause. It could be stretched a little bit with the elastic clause, okay? Powers are not specifically given to the federal government, but can be interpreted through the elastic clause as necessary and proper. Sorry, that went over a little bit, these crayons. I'm not sure I like this background anymore. All right. Reserved powers. Powers not given to the federal government are reserved for the state. So anything that is not given to the federal government, the states are allowed to decide. Examples include the right to regulate education, marriage, and local criminal proceedings. Concurrent powers. There are some powers that both the federal and state governments share. For example, both the federal and state governments maintain highways. Okay, it's good to know. And there's the separation of powers. Different branches of the government have specific powers given to them by the Constitution. The executive branch. Executive branch is the president and his administration. They have the power to make treaties, command the armed forces, make appointments, suggest Supreme Court nominees, suggest legislation, create the budget, and veto laws. Okay, those are the powers of the president. The legislative branch has the power, I think I just read that. Oh, no, there's more. Okay. Legislative branch has the power to make laws, approve nominations to the Supreme Court. Oh, I'm sorry. Anybody need a nap? Legislative branch. Who's in the legislative branch? Congress. House. Okay. They have the power to make laws, approve nominations to the Supreme Court, ratify treaties, declare war, coin money, and raise taxes. Then there's the judicial branch. The role of the judicial branch is to interpret the Constitution. The Supreme Court decides if a law or action of the President or Congress is unconstitutional. Let's go back up. I'll leave you on that one for a minute so you can finish. Flip that pretty quickly. Sorry about that. 27, the Electoral College. Hotly contested after the last election. Electoral College. People do not vote directly for the president. Instead, people vote for an elector, and the elector votes for the president. It's all or nothing in terms of electoral votes from a state. A candidate either wins the state and gets all the votes, or votes go to the other person. Okay? Recently, some people have suggested a constitutional amendment to elect a president by popular vote instead. Okay? So each state is given a certain number of votes. I can't think of any off the top of my head right now. Whoever wins the popular vote within that state, that's who that state goes to. Okay, that's how the Electoral College works. Checks and balances. The Constitution arranges for each branch of government to be checked by another branch so that no one branch can get too powerful. Again, they didn't want to go back, our founding fathers did not want to go back to living under a king. So they wanted to make sure that they split up the government into separate parts and that those parts can have the ability to go against each other if they don't believe that what they're doing is right. How the executive branch is checked. Congress can override a presidential veto. So if a president vetoes a law, they can actually override it. Congress has to ratify treaties and approve appointments made by the president. The Supreme Court can decide an action of the president is unconstitutional. So he can be checked by Congress, he can be checked by the Supreme Court. Or she. Checks and balances, how the legislative branch is checked. The Supreme Court can decide that an act or action is unconstitutional, or the president can veto a law that the legislative branch puts through. How the judicial branch is checked. The president appoints nominees to the Supreme Court. Congress can amend the Constitution, which is the only way for another branch of government to change a Supreme Court ruling. It's a big one. Congress can amend the Constitution, which is the only way for another branch of government to change a Supreme Court ruling. The impeachment process. The House of Representatives investigates and files charges. The House votes, and if enough evidence is found to bring about impeachment proceedings, this has happened, I want to say twice before. once it actually, well, he didn't actually get impeached, he actually resigned, but, and the other time he didn't have to be. Okay? The House votes, and if enough evidence is found to bring about impeachment proceedings, then the president or other public official is impeached. The Senate acts as the jury for the removal trial of impeachment. 2 presidents have been impeached, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. So 3 times, because impeachment proceedings were brought against Nixon, but then he resigned. Flexibility. The Constitution can be adapted to meet the changing demands of the U.S. It's a big thing. Congress can take on more powers by doing what is necessary and proper, in quotes, what they deem to be necessary and proper. The Constitution is interpreted by the Supreme Court. That's called judicial review. The Elastic Clause we talked about before. This clause gives the federal government the power to take on extra powers in the best interest of the nation. Again, in quotes, necessary and proper. Loose constructionists favor a wide use of the Elastic Clause. Elastic Clause means that we're stretching the definition, stretching, elastic, okay? Strict constructionists do not want the federal government expanding their powers. Going back to Federalists and Anti-Federalists at that point. Judicial review. The Supreme Court has the right to interpret the Constitution and determine if an act or action of Congress or the President is constitutional or not. The amendment process. 2/3 of both the Senate and House of Representatives need to approve an amendment to the Constitution. 2/3 of the Senate and House have to approve an amendment to the Constitution. Then the amendment is sent to the states for ratification. 3/4 of the states need to ratify it for it to become a permanent change to the Constitution. Again, another way to prevent the government from having too many powers, too vast a power, and to prevent us from living under a king. 37, a filibuster. Maybe you've heard this word before. A filibuster is when a representative or senator gives long speeches in an effort to delay or obstruct legislation that he or she opposes. The House of Representatives has rules as to how long they can debate since there are so many representatives. In the smaller Senate, unlimited debate continues with the idea that a senator should have the right to speak as long as necessary on any issue. And cloture. The 1917 rule that says Senate can end the debate with a 2/3 vote. 2/3 is very hard to get. The record for the longest individual speech goes to South Carolina's J. Strom Thurmond, who filibustered for 24 hours and 18 minutes against the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Against the Civil Rights Act of 1957. I think someone came close not too long ago. I'll have to look that up. We're almost done. I think we'll end at 40. Okay? So we're already at 23 minutes. I think that's good. 38, unwritten constitution. George Washington began a few precedents which are not part of the Constitution, but have always been in place. In essence, cabinet positions, political parties, for a long time, the 2-term tradition that was ultimately changed with an amendment. Alexander Hamilton's 4-part financial plan. Federal government assumes the war debts of the states, form the national bank, an excise tax on whiskey, and a protective tariff, which was a tax on imports. Okay. And I'll go to 40. John Marshall's Supreme Court decisions. Oh, you know what? We'll do this one next time. We're only going to go to 39. We're going to start with John Marshall's Supreme Court decisions after. Okay? All right, 25 minutes. Have a good day.